All right, everyone. So at this point, I'm going to address the videos for this module for module 3, as well as chapter 6, 7, and 8. So I just wanted to make a quick note. I'll address the videos as they relate to the different chapters. But there's 4 videos for this week. They all have really great content that really dives into the areas that you're interested in for those videos. Just to be transparent, though, the exams, the midterm and final, are based only in the Gladding text. So although the videos will help solidify concepts and I think really help you for the exams, but just so I'm transparent there, the book is the main basis for the exams. All right, so let's start with chapter 6. Just grabbing the book really quick. I'm going to address a few areas. So on ethics, this point in the program, I believe all of you have gone through the ethics course. But I did want to highlight on page 131 where it talked about meta-ethical principles. So I'm going to pull up the book to that page as well. So the reason why I wanted to highlight the meta-ethical principles section in the Gladding text is because oftentimes, ethics comes down to overarching principles rather than here's what you should and shouldn't do. Some things are pretty clear cut, like don't have sex with your clients. But a lot of times it gets pretty gray quickly. And it does come down to like, how are you interpreting and how are your colleagues when you consult legal when you need to do that? How are you all seeing that you're kind of honoring these meta-ethical principles of autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, fidelity, and justice? Different codes of ethics are likely going to have slightly different meta-ethical principles that are addressed at the top of the codes of ethics, but a lot of times they're going to cover, those core there. So yeah, I just wanted to encourage you to be really thoughtful of not just kind of brushing past those of like, oh, okay, that's what all the codes of ethics say, but now I need to go into the nuances. Like, sure, the nuances are very important, but like I said, it's going to come back a lot of times to like, okay, am I doing good for the client by making the choice that I'm making? Am I avoiding doing harm by the choice that I'm making? Am I honoring their autonomy and their confidentiality? So when it comes to, like a gray area, and I think family counseling and couples counseling can get gray pretty quick because there's multiple people involved, especially if the family decides to separate at some point, maybe after you've done counseling work and they're looking for records. And the book, it talks about that as an example, so you have to be really thoughtful of your ethical obligations when dealing with not just one individual client. But a few principles for making ethical decisions would be, number one, I think it's super important to self-reflect, to not just kind of rashly make decisions, but self-reflect and figure out, okay, what are my reactions? What are my beliefs? What are my, experiences of the ethical conundrum? And then obviously go to the code. Don't just, oh, I think it says this, or I remember this, but go and see, okay, ethical code A to B or whatever it is. I just threw that one out there, but just go to the specifics and see, okay, here's where the gray area or here's where the challenge is, just so you have the exact clear language that you're working with. And another major principle is to consult. You don't need to be making these decisions in isolation. Obviously, you need to attend to confidentiality and not just be disclosing everything to whoever you're consulting with, because you likely or you may not have permission from your clients to do that. But consultations can be really important. And, these are the last 3 things that I talked about of self-reflection, going to the code, consulting. Those are all, generally principles of being a part of ethical decision-making models, but oftentimes go through an ethical decision-making model, follow a structured process just so you're attending to it. And then you can document that. You can document, okay, I've gone through these steps. I've gone through this specific ethical decision-making model. I've consulted with these individuals, and here's the conclusion that I came to. So that documentation of that process is usually really, really important. I guess the last thing from the ethics chapter that I wanted to address was on page 138, just the family reflection. It talks about just like how you deal with injustices. How do you voice concerns or when you see conflicts? And how do you address potential unethical behavior in colleagues around you? So I'd encourage you to be thoughtful of that one. Uh, okay, so chapter 7, the process of family therapy. So, just really quick, I don't need to go into a lot of depth on the common factors because the video for this week, one of the videos addresses the common factors from, the creator or one of the creators of kind of the collection of this idea of common factors. But I think a lot of times we emphasize, okay, the specific approach that we're using, like CBT or person-centered or whatever it is, that's what matters most. That's what's going to lead to change. And one approach is better than others. So if you haven't heard about the common factors yet, please go. Uh, let's get her. So pages 155 to 156 in the 7th edition of the Gladding text talk about the common factors. And I think it's really important because it addresses that, extra therapeutic or things that occur outside of the therapy room. That accounts for 40% of what works or what leads to change in your clients. So things that are just kind of outside of your control, almost half are just kind of outside of your control. The therapy relationship accounts for 30% of gains for clients and forward progression for your clients. And I think that really attends to the next section in the chapter after the common factors addresses the personhood of the counselor or of the therapist. So who you are as a person, your personhood is really important in developing that therapeutic alliance. So yeah, 30% is like where's the strength of the counseling relationship? If there's a strong relationship, then that's usually, like it says, accounts for 30% of the relation of the gains. Then, to what extent do the clients expect, progress to occur through counseling? What expect do they have like hope that it'll be helpful, as well as just a placebo of just going and it's beneficial just from a placebo effect. That accounts for 15%. And then the model and techniques that we use, so the theoretical roots and specific techniques that we use account for 15%. So much smaller than I think people would expect. But I just want to go back to the therapeutic relationship. So often those are just using those core skills, being a human with them, really connecting with them. I'm not saying that should only be it. Like 15% is significant. So we need a model, we need a specific technique. And the common factors talks about it, but it doesn't really matter which one it is. It just means you need to have one to orient yourself as the counselor, and you need to believe in it and use it to ground your work. So if we're attending to the relationship and we're using, a helpful model and technique, that's counting for 45% of what's effectiveness in counseling. So anyways, I'd encourage you to kind of be thoughtful of that, because I think that can be really important to just, not get lost in kind of the nuances of techniques when the broader picture of the relationship is really what, really accounts for change. All right, so a couple specifics in addressing the process of family therapy, I guess. As usual, I'm not addressing everything, but just a few principles that I think are important. So the text addresses, common problems for beginning family therapists. So I'd encourage you to go over things that beginning counselors overemphasize. And some examples of that are like focusing on details, getting information rather than addressing the process of what's happening between the partners or the family. And another one is kind of coming to an early resolution, thinking that, okay, we're good now, when really there's deeper core issues that are still unaddressed. So sometimes, and there's others as well. So go through those and be thoughtful of, okay, what areas might I overemphasize that would kind of impede being helpful to the family? Then there's areas that we underemphasize. So that could be, I think the one that stood out to me from page 163, I believe. The nonverbals. There's others as well, but that one, so if we underemphasize the importance of the nonverbals in the family, like maybe if someone kind of sighs or scoffs or rolls their eyes, those can be really important indicators, but sometimes beginning counselors don't address that. So just things to be looking for. A few other just kind of terms and processes in counseling in family counseling that I think are really important is this idea of enmeshment. So enmeshment is this idea that there's like this over involvement between family members where they're almost like fused, they're too close. And this is, I'm kind of pausing as I'm saying this because this is culturally sensitive. Various cultures are going to view, the involvement of family members to a different degree. So I do want to highlight that from the start. So to one culture, one behavior might appear to be enmeshment to another, but to that culture, like it's not enmeshment at all, or they don't experience it that way. But overall, the principle is okay, we're over involved, whether that's, emotionally involved. So, like, sometimes it can be like maybe a parent wanting to know all the details of their children, and maybe especially as they're like growing to be adult children, and the adult children can't make their own decisions because they have to kind of filter it through the parent in order to make a decision. So that's just one small example of how enmeshment, this over involvement, can impact the family system. And maybe that's been a pattern for years that, like, okay, back to the example that the child has to get approval through the parent before they can make any decisions. And that's like, maybe at one point that was developmentally appropriate. But as it continues on, where, okay, I need to start making my own decisions, once again, culturally appropriate, uh, can they do that? So this idea of this over involvement, this fusion between family members without having enough healthy, separation, and healthy is going to be kind of determined family to family. Another concept that I think is important is this idea of the scapegoat, and I think I've kind of addressed this before, but it's basically where one family member receives the role, or it's receives the focus. So the family member is the problem child is one example. And so in the video of unresolved loss, that video, this genogram is used in that video. So I'd encourage you to watch it. But the parents focus on the teen's behavior and they say, okay, we came in here for their daughter's problem. Uh, so it's almost like they were avoiding certain aspects that they needed to do some internal work on. And in their marriage, and the scapegoat was able to be the focus, but the counselor was able to kind of work through that and untangle that scapegoat process. The last thing that I want to bring up from chapter 7 is this idea of circular questioning. So you've likely heard this concept in your group class, or if you haven't taken it, you will. But on page 171, it talks about circular questioning. And it's basically, if there's four people in the room and two members of the family have kind of been talking and maybe been in conflict or arguing a little bit, the counselor asks one of the other two members of the family to address, like, what do you hear happening right now? Or what's this like for you going on? Or how are you hearing, I'm struggling to think of a specific question. Maybe it could just be like, what happens at home when this occurs? So it just is basically a way of getting other family members involved, because that can often kind of lead to larger insights. It's kind of like breaking the pattern of just like that friction occurring, and it's bringing another perspective that can shift it. And some of you asked about, how to get inactive members of the family involved, and circular question can be really helpful. So it can bring others who have been inactive to like focus on the exchange. So I guess for couples counseling, it could be, or even family counseling, if there's some sort of dynamic that was being talked about by family members, so returning to another family member who's been kind of inactive and saying, what came up for you when he said X, Y, or Z? What's your take on X, Y, or Z that was addressed? And even kind of how I talked about earlier of like, how do you typically respond when your parents are fighting at home? What happens there? Or what's coming up for you right now? So those are a few questions to like kind of get the family perspective, rather than just kind of addressing one person with others onlooking. All right. So those are the last thoughts for chapter 7. So chapter 8, let's finish here. So this one, some of you will be more interested than others, I imagine, for this chapter, but it's couples and marriage therapy and enrichment. So there's two videos. There's a couples counseling video and a sex intimacy. I can't remember the last word there, but there's an intimate relationships or something like that video in the module. So those ones can be important to watch if you're interested, and in better understanding couples and marriage counseling and therapy. So just a small hint, John Gottman is addressed in the text, and Gottman is a pretty big name in the marriage and couple realm, so that might be important just for exams, in this class, but also just in general, like the NCE, it's for licensure and everything. So just a quick thought there. One of the main last things that I wanted to bring up though was EFT, or emotion focused therapy. So those are, that approach is addressed between pages 196 and 201. So it's often used in couples work. But the core of, so yeah, I just wanted to give a highlight this specific approach because I think it can address some important characteristics for couples. So it's based in attachment theory, so how to help two unique individuals who have different cultural backgrounds and family of origin backgrounds, how to kind of bring them together to be able to attach and to develop a secure connection with each other. So how to develop these loving bonds, emotional accessibility with partners, and vulnerability, a responsiveness to each other's feelings and to your own feelings. I think the last big kind of core principle of this approach is that I think it can work through early attachment disruptions related to having a secure base and a safe haven. So those two principles, just as a reminder with attachment theory, is kids need to find to have a safe haven, a place that they can go to where they feel loved, nurtured, accepted, where there's emotional responsiveness, and that's usually the caregiver, the parent figure, uh, for the child. So like if they get hurt, they'd come back to the safe haven to be consoled and cared for. When they're crying or scared, once again the parent consoles them, and that develops this idea of a safe haven. But then the secure base is that they have a place where they can launch from, so they can go into the world. So they have this safe, secure, it's almost like a ship vessel where, from the dock, you can branch out and go to sea to learn. Uh, but once again, when there's a storm at sea, you can come back to the secure base or the safe haven and be nurtured. So a lot of times adults haven't had that in their lives. And then they get into marriage relationships and they're struggling with their emotions. They're struggling to feel secure and accepted. And so once again, EFT addresses that. So there's three stages, and I'll just kind of address them really brief. And wouldn't consider myself like an expert in EFT. Just to clarify that, that's an approach that needs further training and further thoughtfulness, but it is a pretty common one. But there's three basic stages. So number one is just like recognizing what are the core emotions that seem to be surfacing regularly. What are the patterns of emotions in each partner? And then stage two, and that's almost like at stage one, really quick. That's almost like a stage where each partner is able to kind of be given some space with the counselor and with each other, find what are the core emotions and patterns of emotion in each partner. So kind of like at an individual level. But then stage two is where, each partner is given, space and emphasize their, expressing their feelings that they need to express. Uh, and maybe even expressing the attachment bonds that weren't there. And the counselor helps to elicit these reactions and these emotional feelings and getting to this place of vulnerability, and can kind of start to guide and model to the other partner how to be sensitively attuned to the emotions of the other partner. So the partner who's not talking, who's listening to their other partner talk about their feelings, the counselor can attend to them, and then the counselor can kind of start to help them to attend to them, maybe through this idea of circular questioning of like, okay, what's coming up for you? How are you feeling when your partner's talking about this deep sadness? So it's like getting out of this reactionary mode of responding to feelings and kind of like more process focused. The last stage is kind of reviewing and focusing on, okay, through our work together, we've experientially developed new ways of being, new ways of responding to feelings. So it's almost like summarizing and highlighting the overarching process for the couple, and kind of re-navigating, reshifting to, okay, emotions can be accepted internally for us, and we can also communicate them to a partner who can learn to accept them and address them. So it's really just being sensitive and accepting and giving space for feelings in a marriage and couple relationship, and not to just kind of avoid them or turn inward, or just hold them inside until they blow up. It's just kind of this emotional openness can be a big part of EFT as well. So the very last you know area that I wanted to direct your attention to is on divorce therapy. So there on pages 205 to 206, there's bullet points that talk about different ways of addressing divorce therapy. So that's basically the couple is choosing to divorce, but how can they do that in a way that's more beneficial than rather than kind of the explosive divorces that you hear about or that you see in popular culture. through like movies or whatever. But yeah, it can. Just a few examples of some of the bullet points that I think are really helpful is it talks about focusing on I statements, kind of banning the word you to be like a you focused blame statement to like I. Here's how I feel, or how I felt. So it's almost like kind of being cathartic to get out that experience, so you're not holding on to those feelings for a long time. That will kind of be difficult moving on after divorce. Another bullet point that I found helpful was, focusing on feelings rather than facts. Facts you can kind of fight about the facts of like, oh no, this happened, this happened, this happened. But feelings, it's more just like, okay, as in the text talks about how just focus on your values. Like, here's how I felt. Here's what was important to me, and here's how I felt about it. It was challenging, or here's how I feel moving forward. Here's what I'd like and what I value. So, anyways, I think addressing your attention to other bullet points and other principles could be particularly helpful. Uh, so with that, I'll wrap up this video, but if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.